Welcome back to Ancient Wales. And this is our last episode, I think, in the Iron Age that we're going to discuss. So I wanted to kind of go a bit of a different direction from the last few. We've done kind of a overview of different subjects, and we've kind of hit on various details I kind of wanted to feature in the podcast. So you have how houses were built, what use was different items, how they did things like farming, and how hunting and fishing and all of these things interreact, and things like, how wars were fought, what was generally the type of things people used to fight them, the art style, the religious mythologies, and all of those things as far as what we can understand or possibly know, the way that iron itself was crafted, how did it become used, and who brought it to Britain. And then, of course, we talked a little bit about how other people from outside started to see this new land and to try and understand and explain it, which is something that I think we're getting into the details of, or the extracts of, as we go. So this is episode 10, Iron Age Britons, New Finds and New Stories, as we discuss what did we find since the original recordings that I did for this discussion of Iron Age Britain. What things happened to change some of our perspectives, and what things happened that are just new and interesting and might have some relationship to changing the picture of the world as we understand it. We're never going to be able to fully change or understand everything about a world that's 2,800 years ago. It just isn't physically possible without written records and without some way of being able to find new items that would totally blow us away. I mean, a lot of it's probably decayed and disappeared long ago. And of course, we don't have the understanding from these people about who they were, what they even described themselves as. We have estimations because of the Romans. They probably give us approximates, but I always call that similar to how we understand anyone who's in a non-literate society that then comes bumping up against a literate one. And so the literate one defines what that society is. And I think that's something we have to understand when we talk about, especially this period, that even though we have names, we have, various tribal names, we have leader names that come out during the initial Roman invasions, they aren't necessarily indicative of how the people may have called themselves. They may be transliterations of the names. They could be mistakes. Keeping in mind, most of the people who were writing about this weren't even necessarily in Britain when these things were happening. So they're getting it second or third hand in some cases. And so pronunciation would be different. Everything about it would be different than the way we understand it if we were there talking to these people. And if they told us what, my tribe is called this, or my area is called that, or the leader of my people is called this. And so we have to rely on the sources we have, and that's fine. And within it, it's understandable, and we have to live with it. We have to understand it. We have to relate to that because that's what we have. So forever and always, unless some miracle happens and we suddenly stumble across some Celtic find that actually says, here be the blah blahs, we're never really going to know any of that information without a time machine. But that's okay. We can still define what people are. And actually, the one advantage that archaeology has over, say, history is that archaeology can help us to understand what these people day-to-day lives may have been like, much more on the ground floor of what the average person is dealing with. And then in some cases, what the rich person receives at the end of their life. Those are kind of the definitions of what we're seeing. And I think in a way, it's almost a more whole vision than the one history would give us written by someone else. Because what it does is it gives us much more inclusion of things that wouldn't necessarily always be there. Sometimes a understanding that wouldn't necessarily be there. We would become much better at understanding, okay, these people were like this, or there was an intermixing between this group and this group, which in the writing might have said, well, this group wiped out this group. Well, no, they just combined into one for different reasons, right? So for that reason, it's very indicative of kind of how archaeology definitely gives us a very different view, but it also has to be measured within the confines of it can give us an incomplete view. Just because it says one thing doesn't necessarily mean it is that thing. And we have to understand it. And finds and archaeology are always changing our understanding, but also our understanding can sometimes change the archaeology. Just because you find someone, for example, who may look a certain way or act a certain way in their burial, that may not be absolutely what that person was. It may be more about maybe somebody was playing a joke. Maybe there was some sort of rich uncle, as an example, who may have splurged on something so that this really poor person may have had a really rich burial. There could be all sorts of things that we don't fully understand because not having the context, right? All of that kept in mind, all of that understanding made. I think it's important to put it all into context as we talk further about all this stuff, because we're going to get into subjects that now talk about the new understandings we've come across, but keep in mind that even those may be changed as time and understanding and growth happens, much like they have with how we've looked at a bunch of different subjects, anywhere from, the Middle Ages to now, and how it is interpreted is very different, right? Our explanations for a lot of things during the Middle Ages would have been, well, that God did that. God put that there. And then over time that changed and we changed with it. So all of this has to be understood within this category of context. So let's start talking about it, shall we? So in just the last decade, discoveries across Britain have transformed our understanding of what is effectively a very mysterious area. We once pictured Iron Age Britain as a world of hill forts, painted warriors, and scattered farming tribes. Isolated, simple, and largely unknowable. But now, thanks to new sciences and dramatic archaeological finds, we're learning something very different. There were societies full of skill and ritual, movement and meaning. People lived not just with survival in mind, but with imagination and belief and connection to their land, their ancestors, and of course to the wider world beyond it. Let's, of course, begin with the flatlands of eastern England, near the quiet waterway in Cambridgeshire. In 2016, archaeologists working in Whittlesea uncovered something extraordinary, a prehistoric village that had burned down 2,800 years ago. The settlement is known as Must Farm and has been built on wooden stilts above a slow-moving river where the fire broke out, possibly accidentally, possibly deliberate. We've talked about this actually during the podcast. In the past, the structures collapsed into the water, and what should have been total destruction became instead total preservation. Buried in the anaerobic mud were the most complete remains of a Bronze and early Iron Age domestic site ever found in Britain. Wooden utensils, textiles, fragments, complete ceramic pots with food still inside of them. You could even see marks left by the weaving on the floor and the layout of the rooms in the roundhouses. This wasn't a rough and ready survival camp. It was a sophisticated planned village with evidence of long-distance trade and specialized craftsmanship and a well-fed community. There were grinding stones for cereals, delicate combs carved from bone, and ropes and baskets still intact. The sheer quality of life at Must Farm suggests that the Iron Age life, at least for some, was secure, creative, and even comfortable. It also revealed something else, that Iron Age people were embedded into their environment. The river wasn't just a backdrop, it was a lifeline. It brought food, transport, and possibly even spiritual significance. Must Farm tells us that far from being a world of scarcity and hardship, parts of Iron Age Britain were vibrant and skilled and thriving. So from that, let's shift from the earth to the lab and from material culture to ancient DNA. In 2018, a team of scientists at Harvard and the Wellcome Sanger Institute published results from a sweeping genetic study drawing on data from hundreds of ancient British skeletons. What they found was startling. Around 1300 BCE, during the Late Bronze Age, a major migration occurred, and people from continental Europe, most likely from what is now France, moved into Britain in significant numbers. These weren't warriors or conquerors, they were likely settlers, farmers, families, and artisans, bringing with them new genes, new ideas, and likely new languages. The results upended older theories that suggested a static, unchanging population from the Neolithic through to the Roman period. Instead, Iron Age Britain was shaped by waves of human movement, by interactions with the continent, and by cultural fluidity. This influx of new people likely influenced everything from pottery styles to farming techniques to religious beliefs. It helps explain why so many aspects of British Iron Age culture resemble the continental Latène or Hallstatt traditions, which we've talked about in the past, how that change may have migrated across into Britain through various different routes. Not just through diffusion or the spread of the culture, but through actual physical migration. It also means that we have to rethink what it means to be, in quotes, Celtic. Instead of a single monolithic culture spreading outward, we're looking at a network of interrelated communities sharing ideas across the land and sea. The Iron Age wasn't isolated, it was cosmopolitan in its own way. Since the 2018 landmark study, ancient DNA research has only expanded. New technology and larger sample sizes have allowed researchers to map not just major migrations, but to a degree, fine-grained patterns across regions and families. A 2021 analysis of the ancient genome revealed that while late Bronze Age migration reshaped the population, the Iron Age itself was surprisingly genetically stable. For centuries, from around 1000 BCE through the Roman conquest, most people in Britain shared a common ancestry. The faces and names may have changed, but the genes stayed largely consistent. What did change, however, was culture. Pottery styles evolved, new burial practices appeared, and art forms developed, often without any significant genetic turnover. This shows us that culture was not always tied to ancestry and that identity, beliefs, and artistic expression could spread through trade, diplomacy, or imitation, not just through blood. Another breakthrough has been the ability to reconstruct family trees from burial sites. Iron Age cemeteries, scientists have discovered, held multi-generational kin groups and sometimes more surprising connections, half-siblings, stepchildren, and individuals with no direct biological link, possibly adopted or integrated through marriage or custom. This suggests that Iron Age societies may have been more complex in their family structure than we imagined, and potentially more fluid roles were held for women and children. We've discussed in greater detail about that specific possibility. There are also signs of a global connection even before Rome. At one site in Kent, a woman is buried in a Roman-era grave, had North African ancestry. While she lived slightly later than the traditional Iron Age, her presence hints at a far-reaching ties that may have existed earlier than we assume. Ancient DNA continues to add detail to the story of Iron Age Britain, and it reveals not just where the people came from, but how they lived, loved, and belonged. And as sites are studied, the more the story is becoming more human, more intimate, and more surprising. So, we've talked a little bit in the past about what an Iron Age Britain had in food, and some of this has changed over time. Until recently, most textbooks would have told you that Iron Age people ate a mix of porridge, foraged berries, and roasted meat. But recent advances in isotope analysis, studying the chemical signatures in human bones and teeth, have painted a more nuanced picture. In Iron Age communities across Britain, people consumed a diet heavy with grains like barley and emmer wheat, alongside of dairy products, pulses, and in some regions, seafood. The reliance on cereals was stronger than expected and consistent over time. In fact, some coastal communities appear to have incorporated a significant amount of shellfish and fish into their diets, suggesting a more flexible and regional approach to food, much like would have been the case in the medieval period, in the Roman period, and even today. But food wasn't just sustenance. There's evidence of seasonal feasting at sites like Danebury Hill Fort, massive quantities of animal bones, mostly pig and cattle, have been found in specific layers alongside pottery and fire pits. These weren't just everyday meals, they were communal gatherings held during a season of festivals, harvests, or rites of passage. Food has ritual meaning, not just nutritional value. Sharing meat at a feast could signify status reinforcement of alliances or mark sacred ordinances. In some places, charred animal bones were buried deliberately, perhaps as offerings to the gods or ancestors. Eating in Iron Age Britain wasn't just about filling your stomach, it was also about feeding of the soul. Iron Age religion remains one of the most mysterious elements of this era. Without written records, we rely on patterns in the land, the placement of objects, and the traces of ceremony to tell us how people understood the divine. It's incredibly difficult. It's hard to know for sure. We are only really starting to make educated guesses based on looking at other religions. And I think over the last 100 years, we've made a lot of progress, but we're nowhere near where we need to be. Recent excavations at the Arthur Stone in Herefordshire have added a fascinating piece to this puzzle. Long thought to be in an isolated Neolithic tomb, new digs in 2022 uncovered signs that the site was reused in the Iron Age. People returned to this ancient monument, performing rituals, leaving offerings, and reshaping its sacred meaning. This speaks to a broader trend that was happening at the time. Iron Age Britons often made pilgrimage to ancient sites, long barrows and standing stones, hilltop enclosures, and treated them as places of power, memory, and connection. You can see that idea, the idea that you would worship something that is known as being important or sacred, but maybe not remembered as to why it was honored in that way or understood in that methodology. And I think that's fascinating in and of itself. Rivers, too, of course, as we mentioned, were sacred in places like the Thames, the Avon, and many, many rivers across Wales. Archaeologists have found weapons, cauldrons, human remains deliberately deposited in the water, offering to deities or ancestors who were believed to reside within the landscape. The spiritual world of the Iron Age was animistic. Trees, springs, hills, caves all had life. They were not symbols, they were presences of gods. And while we hear of druids from later Roman sources, and religious life of early Iron Age people may have been very communal and more decentralized, it was rooted in practice, not doctrine, in places, not temples. In 2017, a farmer near Pocklington, Yorkshire, uncovered a grave unlike any other. Beneath the soil lay a full chariot burial, complete with wheels, horses, and warrior laid to rest with his weapons. It was one of the richest Iron Age burials ever found in Britain. And it wasn't alone. Over the last few years, several similar burials have been discovered in eastern England, suggesting a regional elite who viewed the chariot not just as a tool for warfare or transport, but as a vehicle to the afterlife. These burials were full of symbolism. Warriors go to the other world not just on foot, but in a state honored and adorned and remembered. His weapons, his armor, and even his animals follow him. Death for these people was not the end, it was a transformation. And intriguingly, some of the most elaborate Iron Age graves in Britain belonged to women. At sites like Wetwang, Slack, women were buried with chariots, mirrors, ceremonial items, and many other things. Were they priestesses, chiefs, diplomats? The grave goods show us status, power, and spiritual significance, but they cannot define to us what that meant. The Iron Age was not a world of rigid gender roles, at least in Britain. Power, as these burials show, could be wielded by women and men alike. So where does all this leave us? Well, thanks to new digs, better technology, and insights of modern science, the Iron Age is no longer a shadowy chapter in our past. It's vivid and layered, and very much alive with meaning. We see communities thriving in complex homes like Must Farm. We see people moving across Europe and reshaping the cultures and identity of the people they settle with. We see spiritual worlds surrounded in land and rich in ritual and mystery. And we see an afterlife imagined with chariots and ancestors, not silence. The past, as so often is said, isn't static. It grows, it shifts, and it reveals itself slowly and sometimes dramatically. Iron Age Britain wasn't just a time of warriors and hill forts, it was a time of farmers, weavers, migrants, feasts, and faith. A time of stories that we're only really starting to understand and beginning to truly hear. And because of that, we are only now getting to grips with some of its more intriguing aspects. And I think the one advantage that we have in having the Romans come to a place like this and give it a definition, but also the disadvantage of that is it helps us to pin down where at least some of these groups were, but it also tells a story that may not be fully understood. Like the idea that Boudica was a chief's wife may be a misinterpretation of what's going on in that story. The idea of Catamunda is changing, and understanding of her is differentiating as we're going through it, and we'll talk about that soon enough. As we go through this whole discussion, what we know is that the people that lived in Britain from the Neolithic period at the beginning of the end of the Ice Age, when Neolithic peoples started to settle at the edges of southern Britain and move their way forward through the receding ice into various areas across Britain or into the area between Britain and Europe. All of these people settled in areas that were new, that were exciting, that were something they'd never seen before. And as time goes on and they become more familiar and the link to Europe ends with the slow flooding that happens that creates what we now know as the English Channel, all of this comes about and creates this island that is very different in its own way, but very similar to what we see in the rest of Europe. The language, the culture of this area is different. We know that. We know that because peoples who remained here beyond the original settlement of the Romans and Latin, who were here before the English settlement slash combination with local peoples, and then the Normans arrive. All of these settlements were predated by people who lived here long before that. And with them, they had their own vocabulary, their own way of describing the world, their own way of looking at the world. And we are lucky that even a small measure of it still survives today. We can't say for a fact, as an example, that Brythonic, which becomes Welsh and Cornish, is the language of ancient Britain. It might have been the language of ancient Roman Britain, but we don't know if that's the Iron Age language that's continued through, a Latinization. But what we do know is that the Irish specifically held a language which was unique to them, but yet had a common ancestor to Brythonic, which likely means that even if it wasn't the language of the ancients, it's near enough to be an ancestor of it. And the likelihood is that the language, even as Irish is influenced by Viking languages and later English and Norman French, they are very much still a language unto itself. And much like Scots Gaelic or the Cornish language or the Breton language or what we now call Welsh or Cymraeg, the languages as we understand them have obviously mutated and migrated and changed over 2,000 plus years. But what we do know is that there is a point where all of these languages had a common ancestor. And it shows that the ancient Iron Age language continues to exist in a fashion, even today, in not the Norman French or the Viking language of the North or in the languages that become English, but yet it exists in the languages of Welsh, in Irish, in Gaelic, and how they have, and Cornish, and how all of these languages have mixed together and become a remnant and a record of an ancient people. And I think that's the important part of understanding Iron Age Britain, is that the history that we think of, the understanding that we have of Britain, begins early, and it is something that maintains even now. And it's why those languages are so different than, say, Latin, even though they're influenced by it, especially in Wales and Cornwall. You're not going to have absolute commonality. Certainly, there are loan words that are taken from various languages, English, of course, being one of them. There is a number of different things that change these languages over the years, but at the same time, at its core, at its heart, is still this ancient language that exists. It is still an old language that is beyond even our memories and even those of any ancestor within the last 1,000 years, even maybe even 1,500 years. And yet it's still maintained, it's still held up, it still has links. Much like if you were to look at it, there's commonalities between all the European languages and the Ural steppes, the ancient language that predated any of our languages and became sort of the mother of our language. This is the same sort of thing with whatever the ancient Iron Age peoples spoke. And I think that's important to maintain and understand. And as we go forward and we start to talk more and more about Roman Britain, keep in mind that even through that, we'll still be interpreting it through an Iron Age lens, because roundhouses didn't immediately disappear. The understanding of the world around them didn't disappear. The way that they were doing things didn't necessarily disappear just because there's finally people who are coming who are writing down what they're seeing. And in fact, in some ways, that's what makes them so alien to the Romans, and their own interpretation has to fit in that particular understanding. And it's fascinating to see, and I think it's fantastic, and I can't wait to continue this story. I think I said this last time, and I'll just clarify. We may continue Roman Britain in September, as August, I know, for example, is a month off for most people, or at least for children in Britain. And a lot of people take their holidays, and I know these podcasts are evergreen, but I kind of want to start it fresh as we get into the new year of schooling and everything. So that's where I'm aiming to begin that. So we may have a gap week coming up, just so you're all aware, where this podcast would normally be and will eventually be Roman Britain. And we will also be featuring what I'm hoping is a more graphically interesting video version of this podcast as we enter into Roman Britain and we have things we can kind of feature. And with all that said and done, thank you everyone for listening or viewing today. I appreciate it. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I think it's been intriguing to revisit. I actually think it's been a good pattern to kind of rethink a lot of what I've done in the past and kind of revisit maybe specific moments or subjects where I felt like I sped too quickly through them and maybe want to revisit and take longer with them. And while 10 episodes may not seem like a lot, it is quite a bit considering what we gave the Iron Age previous to this, which I think was 3 to 4 episodes. And they were very brief episodes that I was doing when I was splashing things out every week. So I hope that's been great for you. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I look forward to moving on with a new one in the coming weeks. So take care, everybody. Have yourselves a great day. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can always reach me at the welshhistorypodcast@gmail.com, or you can reach out to me on any of my social media outside of Facebook at Welsh History Pod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/Welsh History Podcast. If you message me, I'm just going to clarify it because I've been noticing, especially advertisers, I'll put it that way, are starting to message me via Facebook Messenger. I don't check those that frequently, especially like Instagram messaging. So if you're wanting to get a hold of me for something specifically, I would much prefer you email me because I see it more directly. And while I do appreciate the comments, you might get annoyed if I don't respond to it within a week. That's part of the problem. I'm not seeing them other than once a week as I'm posting the episodes. So if you want to get a more instant reaction or comment, definitely email is the better way to go. With all that said and done, thank you, everyone. Hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Take care. Ta-ta. Bye-bye. Welsh History Podcast is a member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. To find more information on them, you can do so at evergreenpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.